Christopher Stockman, here you are. Describe what you do now, like what you're doing, who you are, just for people who don't know, just briefly.
Yep, I am a game developer slash game designer. I've been making games for over 20 years now. Started out in Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis land at the ripe old age of 15. And now I am in the wonderful world of VR development. People probably best know of my work of the very first Saints Row, where I was the design director.
Right. And okay, you're a design director. Okay, that game came out, what, 2006?
2006, yeah.
Saints Row, which would be considered at the time a AAA franchise.
Absolutely.
Now, I don't know if it was considered a AAA franchise when you were making it, but the journey to becoming a game director in 2006 is probably a lot different than it is today in 2023, where game directors are, in charge of massive projects.
Yeah.
And there's just a brutal competition to get to those few positions.
Yeah.
So how did you become a game director of a AAA franchise in 2006? Relatively, I would say, maybe early in your career. How did that happen?
Yeah, it was pretty early. I think by then I had been making games for, I guess, a little less than 8 years. And I interviewed for a lead design job at Volition. And it was between me and another person. And that other person had just way, I guess, more recognizable, bigger titles under his belt. He was, I guess, the lead designer on X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter, and he was a designer on TIE Fighter, and just, I guess, more critically acclaimed titles than what I had worked on. And so he ended up getting it. But they still hired me, and they hired me as a level designer for the Punisher project. So I came in, I started making levels for Punisher, and then they came to me and said, well, we have this other project that we're working on. It was titled at the time Bling Bling, and it was the idea was like an MTV lens of gang culture in an open world setting. That's all they really knew from a very high level sort of elevator pitch. Is what is gang culture like in the view of MTV cable channel? So they said, well, they already have a lead designer for it. They call them design directors back then, and but we want you to head up the multiplayer side. It was such a big project that, in their view, that they really wanted a design director for the whole game, and then they wanted a separate sort of lead designer that focused on multiplayer. So they said, Chris, come up with a plan for multiplayer. So I was basically stuck in a room, and I did this whole PowerPoint presentation, and I remember pitching it to them, and they were like, nope, this is terrible. This isn't big enough. You need to be more ambitious. So I went back to the drawing board, and then I came back 2 weeks later, and it was this wild, ambitious pitch that was involved in, I wanted to focus on players being in the world, not in matchmaking screens. So there was no like traditional game lobby. It was when you went in multiplayer, you were in the city, and you were with everybody else, and you could basically pair off with people and then go do separate multiplayer modes. And then I also wanted this idea of clans, but call them gangs. So you could join up with gangs and basically, customize your characters and earn money in all of the various modes that we had, and then spend that money on basically what you would call it virtual trophies, and outfit your character with different clothing and different jewelry and different tattoos. And so when you came across someone that was like fully decked out in the pimp suit, you knew he was a badass that had been playing for a long time versus someone that just came in with a regular t-shirt and jeans. And they loved it. The Volition management was like, oh my gosh, this is great. Let's do it. They went to the THQ president, and they got an additional, I think, $5 million added to the budget. No one really knew what the total budget was. I think at the time they were saying it was like $15 million or something. And so then, I started working with the multiplayer team, and it was just me and like 3 other people, all engineers, and we just cranked away on multiplayer to get something going. But the engine was still being worked on, so it was very, we couldn't play anything for months. So fast forward, I think it was like 4 months later, they came, nothing was happening in the single player part of the game. No one knew what we were making. The design director was this weed smoking hippie dude from San Francisco that just was all about like game design theory and had us do all of these like sessions of like, well, what is a game and what's the core loop and what's good core loop and what's bad, and that's all fine. But if you're not making any decisions, and we're in the middle of pre-production, you're not making any decisions, then the game as a whole is not really making any progress, and no one really knows what you're making. So Volition management came to me and said, you know what, we want you to swap roles with the design director. We want him to be in charge of multiplayer and you be in charge of the whole project. And I said, well, give me $20,000 more a year and I'll do it. And little did I know that I was getting paid peanuts already, so then I just got paid a little bit more peanuts. But it was a lot of money to me at the time, and they said, yeah, do it. And so I came in and I basically I reset everything and I said, this is what we're making. We got 1 month left to go in pre-production. We're going to take what's really good about GTA and borrow it, take what's really bad about GTA and improve upon it, and have a next gen title that launches for Xbox 360. That was sort of my sort of idea, and everybody loved it, and the whole team was on board, and we were off to the races. And that's how I got into that role. Was literally someone sucked and I replaced him.
Okay. It's kind of interesting you talk about like they wanted a game that focused on gang culture,
yeah,
presumably by a bunch of people who know nothing about gang culture.
Nothing. Yeah, Volition was in the cornfields of Illinois.
Yeah, I mean, but the thing I will say is that that could be problematic. But the way it was, and I don't know if this was conscious in Saints Row, it was kind of a satire almost.
Yes.
Was that intentional? Because it almost is like by doing that, it doesn't seem as exploitive as like a bunch of white people trying to make a game about inner city gangs or whatever. And people have no connection to that culture at all. It's almost like it was almost making fun of itself.
Yeah, that was entirely intentional. And part of it, when we set out we knew that there's no way we were going to be a gang simulator, mm-hmm. and truly like live that lifestyle.
Right.
So we looked at it like, well, what's funny? What is a little bit of a stereotype, play on stereotypes a bit, and what is just off the wall, batshit crazy. Mm-hmm. That was, and that partially was from our writer that we hired from QA department. So it's funny because part of my job was to figure out the writing of the game, and I had worked with a writer in the past that I said, well, let's give him a shot and see if he could do it. So I contracted him, and he was good when I worked with him on a Blair Witch budget project for Gallery developers. And so I messaged him. I said, hey, you want to come contract for us and help write this game? And he's like, yeah, sure. And I mean, not naming names, but it was just the worst writing I really had ever. It was almost embarrassing to me because I was the one that was like, let's go. But there was this one line that he wrote that he was like, I don't even remember the line, but I knew that was my drawing. That was like where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, and the straw that broke the camel's back. And I said, okay, I fired him basically, right then on the spot, this line of dialogue he wrote. It was like hotter than a frog's ass or something like that. It was really bad, really, really bad. And so I was like, okay, we're done. And then we basically put out all hands on deck, like across the company. We wanted to hire within the company. So we said, we sent a message and said, if anybody has any writing talent, here's a test. Write this and let's see what you do. And it was like all these writing tests came back from QA. And we had some people from outside as well that we pitched. And the best one was this guy from QA. His name is Steve Jaros. That really gave that game the attitude and the humor that it so desperately needed. And his way of writing dialogue and writing scenes and writing cutscenes was so batshit crazy and funny that that it's what gave that game really like the humor that it did. And then us design team, we were just like, a lot of it was just throwing stuff and figuring out what worked and what didn't.
So that's interesting because they didn't. I might be mistaken, but didn't you start in QA as well?
I did,
Right.
yeah.
And so like that is a path to many senior positions that I'm not quite sure exists anymore, right? Because QA now largely is done, for big games at least, is done by like maybe outsourced teams
Yeah.
or teams that are somewhat completely separate from the development team. They don't even interact with them. Whereas back in those days, the developers would actually go downstairs to QA and talk to the people directly and work with them. And then eventually some people from QA would graduate to design, to even programming and stuff, and then eventually to this day, there's many people in senior positions that, including yourself, they came up that way. But that's like a path that might not even really exist anymore.
Yeah, I think it's really hard, especially in AAA. Well, yeah, period. I think it's really, really difficult to go down that road. And now it's like you really need degrees. You got to go to Full Sail, or you got to go to Digipen and get a degree to even get into the door, unless you're real big in the mod community.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. So now, you worked on the first one, and so how does it feel to see the game be sequelized over and over and over without your involvement?
Yeah, I mean, so the funny thing is that when we got finished with the first one, they had spun off a separate team to start working on the sequel 6 months prior to us going gold, and so I was in Volition's sort of hierarchy and the way they picked design directors. Design director was not a position; it was a role. And so the idea was that anybody could be design director on the project. It didn't matter if you didn't have any design directing experience at all. If the company thought you could do it, you could do it. And they didn't want design directors on multiple projects like back to back. And I just disagreed with that philosophy. And when they said that you're going to go be a designer on another project, I was like, no, I'm not.
Yeah.
and so did all the other leads on Saints Row. And so what they did is they put us in our own separate room, and they were tasked with us coming up with a new IP. And during that, like 6 months of us basically in our own little room, siloed from everything else, to me the writing was on the wall that this was never going to go anywhere. We never could get engineering, never could get a full team together. So I left and started my first company. But to see it, they did a good job, right? They asked me, the leads on Saints Row 2 asked me, so they said, well, if you were going to do a sequel, what would you do? What would you focus on? I said co-op. I would do co-op, make the whole game co-op. I think that's where this industry is going, and I think it'd be a way to differentiate itself from the competition, which was GTA. And continue to go kind of crazy, and push that envelope a bit. And yeah, I mean, and continue to have multiplayer as well. I think people love multiplayer in Saints Row 1, and I think you need to have that. So they did the co-op route. They continued to push crazy. They abandoned multiplayer. I think ultimately that hurt them in the long run. And but Saints Row 2 is widely considered the best one out of them all. I mean, everybody loves that. Love the second one.
Mm-hmm.
So. But they kept sequelizing it. They kept making it more stupid. They pushed that envelope to the point where I think they lost touch of what made it popular to begin with, and it just got to a point where it's not that Saints Row was taken seriously from a story standpoint, but it was taken more seriously than the fourth one or the fifth one when they went to hell, or when they went, they completely reset time, and it was just, they got to the point where what can you do? Like you've already gone down that hole deep enough that there's just no way to climb yourself way out. So they make they reboot the whole thing. They call it Saints Row. But then there's no gangs. It's all about like friendships and clubs and stuff like that. And it's just off the wall, terrible. I thought the environment was a bit bland. It's all in the desert. It's just, and I think they just lost touch of what the fans wanted. And then, that's it.
So, I mean, obviously, I know that there was a lot more steps in between that and going independent, but what eventually was the inspiration to go independent, or were you just kind of forced to go independent?
Yeah, no, I wasn't forced. I had a really cush job working in my own little project on Volition, getting paid quite well, and stock options and all that stuff. And but I'd always had a dream of being an indie studio and working on our own projects. And so a couple of longtime Volition veterans came to me and said, we're starting a company. We're going to do Xbox Live Arcade games. That was when Microsoft rolled out their Xbox Live Arcade, where basically just small teams could push out games. And it wasn't like, AAA budgets. They were smaller titles. You could do it on your own, smaller budgets. And it was a very sort of eye-opening experience. You could create IP and own intellectual property, and I knew the value of that. And so they asked me, they said, okay, we're going to start our own company. We'd like you to come with us and be sort of our biz guy, our design guy. And I said, okay, well, what are you looking to do? Like, well, we want to do a co-op Zelda game. And I was like, how many people are you going to have? Like, oh, just us 3. I'm like, that's a bit ambitious. I said I had this idea that I've been tossing around in my head for a bit, and I was like, I was a big fan of Super Dodgeball for the NES. And I said, why don't we remake that, but have pirates and ninjas battling it out on the dodgeball court? But it's literally in 3D assets, 3D environments, but Super Dodgeball gameplay. And that was sort of, they were like, yeah, we love it. Come. And so I left. I have a family. I wasn't married, didn't have kids. Right. So why not roll the dice?
Yeah, and that was kind of a weird time, right? Because that was like before Steam had self-publishing, before mobile games allowed you to self-publish.
Yep.
And so you went independent in a time where you were still completely dependent on publishers and the existing infrastructure.
Yeah. Yeah, the time, back then with Microsoft, they wouldn't give you dev kits unless you signed with a publisher. Mm-hmm. So you didn't have access to any of the hardware or anything like that to make anything unless you signed with a publisher that had those rights to publish games. And so, that was my job, was to find that deal. And I did. We signed with, back then, Gamecock. If anyone remembers that. That was way back in the day. But yeah, Gamecock was our publisher for that game.
Yeah, basically the Devolver Digital's predecessor.
Yeah, it was Devolver Digital's predecessor and God Games' successor.
Yeah. Yeah, so why did they pick you as the biz guy? I mean, you were a game designer. They just decided you're good at business and now you're the biz guy?
Yeah, they said that I was personable and that I looked, I was personable. I looked good on camera. I did a lot of promotion for Saints Row. I did MTV interviews. I did New York Times interviews. They really pushed me as sort of the face of the game, and so and I had friends. So these Volition veterans had been. It was their only job. They started their careers there. They had no contacts within the industry at large. And I had been, I was big part of the Dallas gaming scene, and I had a lot of friends in the Dallas gaming scene, and I knew a lot of people at Gamecock. And so that was one sort of, it was their way to gain access to that sort of side of the industry.
And I guess you're saying they knew where their strengths were. They knew they were like nerdy developers who really weren't good at that. So they kind of figured you had a complementary skill set, and that's.
Yeah. I mean, I came from the indie lifestyle or the indie scene. I worked at Ritual Entertainment, and that was a Dallas scene, and they had made games for God, and at Ritual, there was a point in Ritual that they slimmed down and got down to like 13 people, and this was after Heavy Metal Fact 2, and there was no CEO. The CEO left, so everybody was like. They were all about projects. They were all about work for hire projects at this point. And so I kind of took it upon myself to go out and did the publisher pitch process on my own volition, so to speak, and got deals. And so I talked to them, that was part of my interview process, was telling them what I did, and they just thought I'd be good at it.
Okay. So is there anything you miss about AAA studios, like the major studio lifestyle? Is there anything about that although it's a little weird because it's also a bygone era, the studio system that you were in, but still, are there elements of like major corporate game development that you miss?
I kind of miss some of the large team aspects of being in a large team or being in control of a large team, being able to get things done a little bit, I guess. Well, it was so strange because Saints Row, we were yes, Volition was owned by THQ, but there was no corporate red tape that we had to cut through. It was literally like, what do you want to make? And this is, and we were given carte blanche to do whatever we wanted. We got to pick our voice cast. We didn't have to go through, a bunch of approvals to get our voice cast. We got a bunch of unique licensed, or not licensed, well, yes, licensed and custom written songs for the game. We didn't have to go through corporate red tape for that. We didn't have to go through corporate red tape to get any decisions made. We just got to make whatever we wanted. That doesn't exist anymore. And so, I guess I sometimes miss being in a team, a large team, and being able to throw out ideas and, them marinate and figure out which ones and have the time and kind of luxury to do that. And that's about it. I'm not a media whore, so I don't really particularly like the attention of working on a AAA project and what that brings to you and the pressures and stuff like that. Although there's different pressures with the indie lifestyle, so it's a double-edged sword, so to speak. But I really don't miss those days at all. There isn't like, I don't wake up in the morning one day and be like, I really want to go make, multi-million-dollar budget titles. It just doesn't exist anymore for me.
And also, I guess you could say you reminisce about having a big team that you're not actually responsible for. You know what I mean? Because if you had a big team as an independent, you have to make sure they all get paid.
Yeah.
And all, like you're responsible for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of like when you're in a major corporate situation, a lot of stuff is taken care of for you that, especially some new independent developers don't realize when they leave their cushy corporate gigs that their employer actually did a lot of the stuff that they're going to have to do now.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very true.
But as an independent developer, you basically thrive in that element of having those responsibilities, but at a smaller scale.
Yes. I love the independent lifestyle, I guess, to some extent, as long as you have a successful product.
Have you ever tried to leave the independent? Have you ever been tempted to go back? Have there been opportunities presented to you since you've left the major sort of corporate lifestyle to go back into the matrix and work inside there again?
Yeah. Before I started my second company, I did go back into that, I guess it was larger AA development and mobile development. And both of those situations were a complete disaster. I mean, I went to Human Head when Human Head was still around. They had hired me for an open world, free-to-play game that was going to be published by Square Enix. And I get there, and literally the day before I start, the executive producer and one of the owners of the company calls me and says, well, Square canceled the project. And we don't have anything for you to work on. You still have a job, but, I don't know how long it's going to last. Mm. And I just moved up there and just rented an apartment. And I just started looking for a job immediately. And I had a job offer relatively quickly from Ubisoft, but it involved moving to Singapore. And I just was like at a point in my life where I just didn't want to sell everything or put everything in storage and go live in Singapore. I just didn't want to do it. It's one of the most expensive places to live, and they weren't paying me that much to basically have the lifestyle that I wanted. So I got a job at Zynga, Dallas. So I moved down to Dallas. I'm thinking, okay, I'm back in Texas. I like Texas. And I go to Zynga, Dallas, and then they close the studio in 3 months. And so I'm like, well, the industry's telling me something. So I started my second company, and I didn't start it with anything but just an idea, and the chips kind of fell into place. But there was a point in my second company's lifespan that I didn't know, what was going to happen. I didn't know, how I was going to pay the bills. So I started looking for a job, and I quickly realized that I've been sort of in the independent / small game lifestyle for so long that I'm almost unemployable by the large, industry studio machine. I'm out of touch, and I've got a stigma attached to me because I've started 2 companies, and now it's like, well, and they would interview me, and they were like, well, if you had an opportunity to start a company, would you do it again? I was like, yeah,
Yeah.
I'd do it again. And then we'd be like, okay, thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah, I mean, once you leave the matrix, they're not going to let you back in. I mean, I tell people who start their own companies, like, you better decide within 3 years of being independent that you're going to stick with this, because if you go up further than that, you'll never get another. They'll never hire you.
Yeah. You're
Yeah.
blacklisted,
Yeah.
essentially.
I mean, they don't say that, but
No, they don't say it.
what they asked you is what they're thinking privately. Like, you're an independent streak, you're going to leave.
Yeah.
And despite the fact that,
And I could have lied. I could have easily lied.
sure, but they know.
Yeah.
I could tell.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So now it sounds like, so with Saints Row, they handed you an idea and you executed it.
Yeah.
But what you do now is you create ideas
Yeah.
and you execute them.
Yeah.
So is there a difference between the type of person that creates ideas and the type of person that executes them? And if they're contained in one person or two people, those qualities, what are the qualities of a designer that creates ideas versus the quality of a designer that can execute the ideas? And let's say, like, the quality of a designer that embodies both. Like, so the creation of the ideas versus execution of the ideas. What's the skill set?
Wow. I mean, that's a good question. I think, man, coming up with ideas is very easy. Whether or not they sell or not is an entirely different part of the equation. But just throwing out game ideas, I mean, anybody can do it. And executing is when you have to, like, literally, in a sense, herd cats and come up with the fun, the core loop of the game, what's fun about it, and iterate. I'm a strong believer in iteration. I'm a strong believer in let's getting something in, let's play it, and then let's look at where the strength, where's the fun, and continually to massage that. And I think a lot of designers are great at coming up with the idea, but they're terrible at the knee deep in development of, like, constantly drilling. Is this fun? What's good about it? What's not so good about it? And being able to separate those things. And, you don't always get it right, even when you ship, but you got to try your hardest. And execution is probably the hardest part of the industry of game design. And that is getting, especially if you have a team. If you're solo, it's hard, for sure. But having a team all buy in, and you're the champion. You're the champion of the game. You're its chief seller. You're selling the idea. You're selling the mechanics. You're selling everything about it. And you got to get your team to buy into the game. If they don't buy into it, then they don't feel invested. They feel like they're just being told what to do. And it becomes a job for them. And great games are not about, like, creating truly great products. It's not about just putting in the 9 to 5 and being done with it. You need to, there's passion involved. And it's hard because, selling that to I got stories on Saints Row where there was art people that quit towards the end of the project. And they quit because they said that the lead designer would come around their office with GTA on PlayStation Portable and would say, well, our vehicle should behave like this. And it's true. I did. I would have, like, GTA's vehicles, I had felt they had a sort of way about them. And instead of me just basically describing in long paragraphs of what I think it should feel like, I brought along a game that I felt that did a pretty good job. And I said, let's try to shoot for this. And at least let's get to this point, and then we can look at where we can go. And I think that the idea designer, purely identity, doesn't do that. They tend to just say, okay, let's do this, and then they can't point out examples, but then they don't follow through. Whereas an execution designer actually follows through and is there from the beginning to the end and pushes it through and really sells the game to the team, but also to a press and marketing and they're the champion of the game. They're the face and the voice.
But also the execution involves creation, right? Because even if you get directives from, like, let's say a creative director, just the basic points of what the game's supposed to be, you still have to come up with creative solutions to execute those bullet points, right? I mean, you have to come up with ideas while you're executing within the framework of the idea man, as they say, right?
Yeah.
So it's like almost like the executor kind of embodies both
Yeah, you know, the crazy thing is that this is how long I've been, well, not long, but this is how far I've been away from like the AAA studio. There was no creative directors at Volition. There was no creative director. There was no executive producer at THQ. For all intents and purposes, I was the creative director, design director, and all rolled into one. And so, you know, ultimately the game rested on me. And I remember, so one of the things that I pushed for in Saints Row was a story. So there was a sort of a studio manager at the company, and he would push his crazy ass design ideas on us. And he came to us pretty early in the project. It was like, okay, what this game is, it should not have a story. It should just basically be a collection of shit that you do in the city, and then at some point you could take the city over. No rhyme or reason, but no story, because story is expensive to do. You got to do cutscenes, you got to do voiceovers, you got to, you know, it's a production, and it just adds to the budget of the game. Really, what should be, it should be about player agency, player choice, and you know. And I said, well, you really need a reason for doing these things, and a story gets you invested in the characters, and it makes you want to progress in the game and to see it through. And frankly, the type of game that we're creating, there's expectations to have a story. Like it or not, we're going to be compared to GTA. And if you don't have a story, as some other open world games like Crackdown, you know, and Crackdown 2 didn't have a story, and I think it suffered from it. And I said, you need to have story, you need to have characters. And they said, okay. And I sold it to him on it and explained why we needed it. He didn't agree with me, but because of my role, he deferred to me. But he said to me, he said, your ass is on the line. If this game comes out and it's terrible, or the story's not good, or it flops, and people, you know, you're fired. You're gonna be fired. And I said, okay, put it on me. Fire me then, if it sucks. And you know, it came out and everybody loved it. Everybody loved the story. They you know, people. We would get emails about people crying because they didn't know if their character died at the end or not. We left it on a cliffhanger. They would be very upset at us, and we're like, yeah, we did our job. You know, if you're that passionate about where you're like emailing us and like saying, how dare you do this, and you know, yeah, you brought out something in them.
So player feedback, that's especially important in independent games, especially today, because back then you weren't as accessible to the audience.
Yeah, there was no Twitter.
Yeah. So how do you determine if some which player feedback you're getting is valid and which isn't? Because sometimes people have, you know, kind of insane requests.
Yeah.
But other times, like, it's actually quite valid. So, like, how do you filter between, like, real user feedback that's actionable and stuff that you think isn't important?
I mean, I think if there's a lone outlier, then I tend to brush that aside. We get feedback from our games quite a bit, and we'll look at, like, in aggregate which things bubble up. Which things are people hate, by and large, on average, and then, you know, and then you have lone outliers. Be like, well, you know, I don't like this, I don't like that, and we tend to not brush those aside, but we kind of put them in the back pocket, and we don't really, you know, we don't think about it too much or act on it. But there's certain things that, you know, like, for example, in Ultra Wings 1 and 2, especially in 2, we came out. And people struggled with grabbing on the virtual stick and being able to hold on to the virtual stick. Ultra Wings 2 is a flight game, VR. It's sort of open world-ish. It's not really a simulator. It's more of a game, but it feels really like you're flying. And we pioneered this virtual control system where you can flick switches with your fingers and hold on a virtual stick with your hand, and you didn't need a flight stick to play the game. So the sequel comes out, and we had this system where you could see your hand, and you just had to keep your hand around the stick and grab on it. But it didn't snap onto the stick. And so we got a lot of feedback from, like, well, you know, we can't do it. So we took that feedback and we like, yep, okay, we see your very valid points, and we added this, you know, snapping onto the stick where you hold the stick and it just snaps on it. And it doesn't really matter where your hand is positioned. You don't need to keep it on the stick itself. You can move it all around in your hands. And it instantly, that was the right way to go. And yeah, so, I mean, we definitely act on feedback, but there's certain other things where people would come in and be like, I'm trying to think of some really like outlier feedback of like, oh yeah, they wanted like, what? I'm trying to think. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank here as to the sort of the, oh yeah, like we want cars in the game. Mm-hmm. I mean, well, it's not a game that focuses on ground vehicles. So we're not gonna drive. Or like, I want a hot air balloon. I want to be able to fly a hot. That's the one thing we've got. I want a hot air balloon. Well, what do you do in a hot air balloon? You just float up. Like that's it. That's the really There's nothing inherently interesting about hot air balloon.
Right.
And so that's not what the game is. So I think the way to sort of you have to look at the feedback is like, does it add to the game in a meaningful way? Like, could it make it better? Do they have valid points? Or is it something where it's just, it's more trouble than it's worth, or it doesn't fit within the theme of the game?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I guess this is kind of related to some of the earlier questions, but, like, why are you still independent? I mean, surely somebody has come along, in this acquisition mania these days. Surely somebody... You have something of value that somebody wants. Have there ever been any attempts to acquire you or make you part of a bigger organization?
Yeah, there was one several years ago. A company out of Russia had came to us and we think you'd be a good fit. We're getting into VR more, and you have the experience, and you have the franchise, and you have the IP, and we want you to be a part of the company. And it got pretty serious. And then ultimately, it fell through, and they sort of backed out, and no rhyme or reason. I happen to think that maybe the reason why is that they got word of that Putin was about to attack Ukraine, and so there was going to be this big brouhaha with working with American companies, and I don't know. That's my theory, and that was it though. That's the only one. We're not opposed to getting acquired, but it's got to be a situation where I just have enough money in the bank and I don't really have to worry about ever working again. And maybe I'll continue working, maybe I won't. I always make games, so it doesn't matter like if I have enough money in the bank. But if I'm going to go work for someone, it has to be damn well worth it at this point.
And it's interesting to see though that you've been an independent developer for I don't know how long, over 10, 15 years, running your own studio, successfully. But yet money flows into these opportunities weren't available when you did Saints Row, but they're plucking people out of big studios and giving them $10 million to start studios with no business experience and no actual independent development experience. But yet those opportunities don't flow to studios of your size, despite the fact that you have a proven track record of like not going out of business and being able to manage money, which is like a basic thing, right?
Yeah, but the problem is that the games that we make are fairly for a small audience, and we're fortunate enough that with the way we develop games is we don't have to have large budgets, and we can make our money back on the type of games that we do relatively easily, but we're small potatoes, and so.
But are you small potatoes because your budgets are based on your revenue. Like you don't have any outside investment.
Right.
So your potatoes are only as large as, you can grow them yourself. So
we just don't want to work with publishers.
Sure.
We don't want to work with publishers. We don't want to answer to anyone but ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I just hate working with publishers. I really don't like it. And and there's been times when I've gone out and I've looked at, publishing and I've gotten deals and I'd just say, no, I'm not taking your money because you want unreasonable, ROI.
Do publishers serve a purpose today? Because back in the 90s and the early 2000s, you needed a publisher to get on store shelves. Or you needed, like you said earlier, you literally needed a publisher to get a dev kit. But those barriers don't exist anymore. So are publishers necessary? And if they are, why in any case? Like what do they actually do?
Money is the only reason. Really, that's the only reason that you need to, that if you just don't have money and you need a team, then publishing route is the way to go, unless you go VC and they take a part of your company and then they expect an exit. And there's a whole strings associated with VC money. There's strings associated with publisher money as well. But that's really the only way that they're still viable. still in business is that they have the money.
Then these days, there's a lot of different ways to get money. Other than the publisher money used to be the only way to get investment into a game, but these days, whether it's crowdfunding or other ways, you can fund games without publisher money.
You can, crowdfunding, Kickstarter, and all that. It's just, boy, that's a lot of work.
But that's also finding. There are sometimes grants and different things available, and it's basically like you kind of have to know where to find those things, and that's kind of what your original co-founders saw in you, is like your ability to find business, right? Like you could go find where the opportunities are, because every once in a while, right, there's funding for something, some initiative, some technology needs to prove itself.
Yeah,
funding development.
It's a good point. When I started the second company, it was around the time NVIDIA was pimping out their Shield streaming console, and there was this big initiative within NVIDIA to basically create content for their store. And they saw the Shield they positioned it as almost like a mini console, an Android-based console that hooks up to your TV and has its own storefront, and you can buy. And so they were really out looking for content. And so I thought to myself, well, this might be a good opportunity to get some easy money with. And I had this game, the space shooter game that I had made with a previous company that went out of business, and I convinced the owners of that company to give me the space shooter back. And they did, and no strings attached. They just gave it to me, and I basically went to NVIDIA. I said, I have this game. I just want to make it for your Shield console. How about some money for that? And they gave me money, and I built up a relationship with NVIDIA and got another project signed with them after we finished the space shooter. And that gave me capital to start kind of getting the team together. And then VR came around, and Oculus was real big, successful in their Kickstarter, and had some friends that worked there. And I remember I was in Austin. I lived in Dallas at the time, and I was in Austin, and I went to the company that made Job Simulator. I went to the owner's house, and he showed me a very, very early build Job Simulator, and using the Vive and the tracking controllers, and I remember picking up stuff. They had the kitchen scene done, and I remember picking up stuff and opening up, and I was like, wow, this is really cool. I think there's a way to do this. And I knew that Oculus bought Facebook, or Facebook bought Oculus, and they were starting to do deals, and they were starting to do grants. And I went to them and I said, I have this idea for this game, open world, like pilot wings in VR. And they were like, yeah, that's great, but we need a demo. So I got together a really small team to do a demo and showed them the demo, and then they were like, yeah, this is great, let's go. And that was the first grant, and then I just got tons of more grants.
Yeah, because as every platform, usually when platforms are new, they have to prime the pump. They have to fund content to be on that platform, because there's no business case to build anything for a platform with no users.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the opportunities you've been able to hunt for and find. But
I'm very fortunate for that.
But as platforms get more established, they don't do that anymore. And then you have to, that's an early stage kind of funding opportunity.
It's a right time, right place, right product situation where you have to fill a hole that they have. And we were the only ones doing that type of game. It filled that hole, and I was able to sign tons of deals to bring our game to their fledgling new platform.
But also, speaking to something else you said, and also, again, when your original co-founders said that you were personable and good at business, I mean, a lot of it too is being around long enough and surviving long enough and knowing enough people that eventually the people that some of them end up in positions of power at some of these companies that then, you have a business, business is about relationships. And so, right, isn't one part about being an independent developer is to maintain business relationships with a lot of people and constantly networking in order to, be in that position. It's not just being in the right place at the right time, right? I mean, there is some strategy and work involved in being in that place.
Yeah, you have to grease some wheels, and you have to, go to conventions, and you have to communicate effectively. And I kind of live in both the introvert and the extrovert worlds. Mm-hmm. I'm most comfortable when I'm just stuck in my cave at home and I'm just plugging away and working on stuff. But I see that I can't just be that. I have to be an extrovert. I have to be out there, and I have to go to the parties, and I have to go and network at events, and I have to go to GDC, and I have to do these things, and it's exhausting to me, but I do them because it's a must. You have to, you know, and I just, that is more important to me than being an employee and just being, you know, left to my own devices.
Sure. And also, I guess there's some, it's almost kind of an insurance policy, right? Because you've seen with all the recent layoffs and stuff, a lot of people who get laid off can't survive outside of a job.
Yeah.
But independent developers are always kind of unemployed. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
They basically have to constantly look for opportunities and find them, and they're never given to them.
I've realized I'm kind of an adrenaline junkie in that way. Safety, being safe and just collecting a paycheck is I get incredibly bored, and as an indie, it's never a dull moment. You're always, you know, looking for, even with successful products, you're still looking for other opportunities. You never rest on your laurels, so to speak. And I live on that. I live on that rush of selling products that we develop in any way I can. It's you know.
So
it drives me.
We've tossed around the word a bit, right? But what really is an indie developer? What is the label? Does it mean anything? Does the word indie actually mean anything anymore?
I feel like an indie developer is you're not collecting a paycheck. The studio's not, you know, you're selling your products to consumers, and there's no middleman beyond that, beyond the store front, right? Or you're selling on your website. You are knuckles on the ground, you know, battling, duking it out for eyeballs. You're not relying on a marketing team. You may employ a marketing team within your studio. I still think you would be considered independent if you had that, but there is no outside entity that governs you, that tells you what to do, that tells you what you can say and what you can't say, and you know, a big org that is telling you what to do. You are the master of your own destiny. You control everything. I feel like that is a true definition of an indie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you know, because a lot of what people consider indie today, I just consider making video games. I mean, if you've gotten a publisher deal, you know, there's so-called indie publishers, but I feel it's an oxymoron.
Yeah, I mean, you're not. I mean, you know, another, you know, definition of indie is you're not owned by anyone, and you know, you're shopping for deals. I mean, Ritual was an indie developer by any means, but they could never work for themselves. They could never make their own games. They always had to do work for hire stuff. But they were not owned by, their paychecks were, you know, not signed by some external company that was, you know, the CEO and, you know, finance. They paid their own employees based on the revenue that they generated from the projects that they signed.
But for most of their history, they were going through publishers.
Yeah. They never, no, through their entire history, they went through
I thought the
publishers.
last game, the Episodic Sin Episodes game, wasn't that a self-published? I can't remember the name of it. When they made the anime and all that
Sin
stuff.
Episodes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there was that Hail Mary last-ditch effort.
It was very forward-thinking, though. I remember when they announced that, and I was like, wow, that's, because I believe I could be wrong. I thought they self-published that or something, and they had metrics. They were telling me about, they had all these metrics, and it was episodic, and it was digitally distributed, and then they had that anime they made. I was, you know, it was really interesting, but it's.
I think that
they owned that IP, right?
They owned it. They did, and but I think it was I want to. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
It might have been a mumbo jumbo. I think a mumbo jumbo published it or something along those lines.
So okay.
I do want to say one thing.
Yeah.
About Saints Row. I love the franchise. I think it's phenomenal. I think it's a sad state that it sort of ended in. I love Volition. I still have friends that work there till the end. So I don't want to come across that I'm disparaging the fifth one. I just felt that that they lost touch of what made Saints Row and what the fans wanted. And so it's sad that they went out of business. I feel bad for the people that work there. And I don't even know the whole story behind why decisions were made. I had heard that they originally was more of a hardcore gang. They really went more of like the first one. with more of a gang stuff, and that they were told no by their corporate overlords that you couldn't do this, that it wasn't PC, and so they had to take a different route. And if that's true, that's just sad, because really developer like that there's still people there that know the IP.
Well, it's a delicate situation. It's kind of what we talked about earlier. I mean, it's a culturally sensitive issue, like satirizing gang lifestyle. It's kind of it's in a spot today. I think it's a little. You have to be careful. It's not. It's these days. I think you have a much broader cross section of people playing games and stuff, and I think that you're kind of exposed to what you're really satirizing might not be funny. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you're right. And so I mean, the route I would have taken if I was put in charge of Saints Row, the reboot, I would have gone back to the drawing board and said I would have done a prequel. I would have put the game in the 70s, and basically had all the characters from the first one be as if they're teens, even some of them younger than that, and talk about sort of the rise of those gangs from the first one, and then you satirize the 70s culture, which from this day and age, it's I don't think you wouldn't be taken seriously, but you would satirize that sort of era, and go back to the basics, so to speak, and then you still can be kind of off the wall and crazy, but not batshit crazy.
But also, you'd have to, I think, involve a writing process that probably is a little bit more inclusive to make sure that you don't cross any lines. Like you might, there's an example. I like Mafia 3.
Yeah.
It was an incredible game. It took place in the 60s.
Yes.
And it dealt with all kinds of racial stereotypes, but I thought it was incredible.
Incredible.
I don't actually know who wrote it. I don't know much about the team that made that.
It was incredible.
But that game was absolutely incredible, and the topics it touched on, but still was a video game.
It was a video game. Yeah, it didn't.
I don't think it sold that well, but I thought that game was absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it touched on topics that are very contemporary.
Right.
And it didn't pull any punches.
And I think you would need, to do what you're saying, you would need a certain type of writing and narrative direction staff that could do that. It's not just like, hey, in 2006, let's do a gang game. We saw some gangs at MTV.
Yeah.
You'd have to do it in a different way. But so what you're saying is you want the Saints Row IP back, and you could do it, but could you do it as an independent? This is something you need a lot of money to do.
Yeah, I need a lot of money to do.
Yeah.
No, I probably no. I don't. I think I would only want it back if no one was telling me what to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, yeah, but there are conditions under which you would like to work with this IP again.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if they came to me and said, "Oh, we want you to reboot it, and here you go, and no strings attached, and we just get cuts of revenue and have at it." I don't even need their money. I could probably get money for elsewhere. I don't want to, I don't want to be tied down to a corporate machine that tells me what I can and can't do. Mm-hmm. Give me the IP, and let me go find a way to make it. And I'm pretty sure I could do that, and I'm pretty sure I could be successful at it.
Well, given current events, I think the IP will probably be available pretty soon, right?
It could very well be.
Yeah.
It'll be a fire sale.
Yeah. So I don't know if you want to talk too much about your corporate structure, but I think you and I have both used like offshore talent, like we have international teams, and for a long time that's a technique people used to mitigate costs and stuff, but also just get a wider talent pool.
Right.
But now we're seeing the rise of AI and all these different tools that can also speed up development and also make things efficient and perhaps cheaper. Have you thought about, it's such a fast shifting industry, I have a hard time trying to comprehend what the implications are for us as game developers. Have you used any AI? Have you thought about AI? Do you have any opinions or ideas of where it's going to take game development in the future?
I mean, we've dabbled in AI just from a generating art perspective, and sort of experimented with it. We haven't actually put it in our next project or any of our previous projects. I'm kind of in your mindset that I have a hard time wrapping my head around how it can fundamentally change game development.
But we know it is.
Yeah,
we just don't know how and why and when.
We don't know how or why or what it's going to be. I mean, is it going to be are you going to be able to wake up one day and be like, okay, I want to play a first-person shooter set in the Amazon with hot chicks as my enemies, and I have to do whatever. I mean, run drugs. Just like crazy off-the-wall stuff. And then suddenly, 10 minutes later, oh, your game is ready to play. Message comes up. Maybe that will happen, and it probably will at some point. But I probably will go to my deathbed always thinking that human-generated stories will be always more interesting than AI-generated stories.
Sure,
maybe I'll be proven wrong.
But, going back to the Saints Row thing, needing, 10, 20, 30, 40, $50 million to make a Saints Row.
Yeah.
Is it possible with AI you could make a Saints Row for $3 million? You know what I mean? Like,
well,
you don't need as many people.
Yeah, possible. But here's the thing. Like, one of the things that we have, I would consider pioneered is a development method of leveraging talent from areas of the world that are up and coming, that have very talented people and very skilled at what they do, and they just don't have the opportunity to work on products other than reskinned slot machine games. And so we've tapped into that. Bulk of our studio is in Manila, Philippines, and we do. One of my very close friends lives out there. He's an American expat that moved out there because it's really incredibly cheap to live. And we have a core group of people there that all come from mobile land, most of them, and they were just making slot machine reskin games. And these are passionate developers and passionate gamers. And they just never had the opportunity to work on original IP. They never had the opportunity to work on what I would consider real games. I don't consider slot machines real games. And we've had almost next to no turnover, and we can do fairly large scoped games for budgets that I could never do if I had a staff here in the West or in Europe. And that's how we were able to get into VR and actually be profitable, making VR games. And just didn't get lucky doing a Beat Saber or something like that. So I think that the end of the story is that I think that there is a way there, and you have to be very fortunate to be in that position. But there's a way to do bigger budget titles. I would like to do bigger budget, bigger scale games, but leveraging talent from up-and-coming regions so that you can take chances and without having to break the bank, without having to completely knock it out of the park to be profitable. You can really take chances and explore different ideas and different genres, and going back to kind of like how things were on PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2.
Yeah, because we've definitely lost some spontaneity. We've lost some there's a lot less experimentation going on with games. Well, at least I guess you could say
on Steam there's
quite a bit, but like when it comes to the so-called AAA games, there's fewer of them now, and they're
almost paint by numbers.
Yeah, and there are far less types of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we can end it there.
Okay.
I think unless there's anything else you want to say, I think we're good.
Okay, cool. Go check out Ultra Wings 1 or Ultra Wings 2 on Steam or MetaQuest platforms, and drop us a line at bitplanetgames.com. Tell us what you think.
All right. Christopher Stockman.
Thanks, Ralph.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.